before the great pyramids pierced the sky, before the feathered serpents danced on painted walls, before the jaguar gods howled through the dense jungles of Mesoamerica, there was only the earth, and the rain, and the river that carved its way through the steaming canopy like a silver serpent in a forest of green. This was a time before time had a name, a land without kings, people without memory, but they were listening. Somewhere along the Gulf Coast of what would one day be called Mexico, the land itself seemed to tremble with waiting. The volcanoes had long fallen silent, their black stones spilled into the rivers and buried under rich clay. The rain came in bursts, churning the soil, breathing life into the roots of cacao, maize, and ceiba trees. Lightning split the sky in sheets, and the thunder cracked like the voice of an ancient god no one had yet dared name. The people who lived here were not yet Olmec. They had no word for civilization, no calendar, no stone temples, but they had ears tuned to the whispers of nature, and they had eyes that saw patterns, rivers bending like serpents, stars pulsing like heartbeats, shadows cast in sacred symmetry. They lived in simple clusters of huts near the water, gathered fish, hunted small game, and coaxed the first maize from stubborn earth. They buried their dead with obsidian blades and polished stones, whispering to the wind in a language that would never be written down. And one night, when the thunder fell in 3 perfect beats and the river turned red with silt, a child was born. They said he came out screaming not with fear, but fury. His fists were clenched, his eyes open, and across his chest, a strange mark like a spiral, the pattern of a shell. The village elder who touched him recoiled, murmuring about the fire inside this one. They named him U-Kan-Lel, though the name itself has long been lost in the jungle fog of time. To the modern tongue, it might be imagined as he who carries the voice of the serpent. As U-Kan-Lel grew, the jungle seemed to bend around him. He was a silent child, observant. He stared at the sky long after others had fallen asleep. He mimicked the calls of the jaguar and owl. He built intricate paths of stone in the river mud and watched how water obeyed him. Some said he could hear what the rocks were saying. Others said he could taste the future in the wind. No one dared mock him. When a fever swept the village, it passed him by. When lightning struck the sacred tree, he was the only one who stepped forward to touch the blackened bark. But U-Kan-Lel was not just spirit. He was builder. He began moving stones larger and heavier than any child should lift. He stacked them in deliberate circles, copied the stars above. He showed the elders that 4 walls could hold heat better than 3, that stone could outlast rain, that fire had rhythm. He invented nothing, but he remembered everything. Patterns from dreams, echoes from the forest, visions from silence. The elders grew uneasy. This was a child born of earth and fire, but not quite belonging to either. They summoned the old priestess, whose face was a map of time. She came to watch the boy in silence. For days. Then she whispered, "He is not a child. He is a marker, a beginning." U-Kan-Lel never asked for followers, but they came. From neighboring villages, from the hills, from across the rivers. They brought him stone, obsidian, seeds, and questions. He answered none of them directly, but he showed them how to align their huts to the sun, how to carve channels for floodwater, how to stack stones to make the rain sing louder. He marked the solstice with fire. He placed stones where shadows vanished at noon. And slowly the people began to build, not for shelter but for meaning. The place would one day be called San Lorenzo, but then it was simply the place of balance. Here the first mounds rose, not burial places but platforms, symbols of height, of order, of dominance over chaos. The rivers were tamed with dikes and basins. The people built rows of houses in a grid. Plaza emerged, and in the center U-Kan-Lel placed a single stone slab, uncarved, unadorned. It wasn't what it was that mattered. It was where he put it. The exact spot where the stars of the jaguar aligned with the eye of the storm. The transformation was subtle, but unstoppable. The people stopped calling themselves families. They became clans. Then something more. Their language began to shift. Words for mine were replaced with ours. Stories of wandering gods gave way to one truth. U-Kan-Lel had shown them the center. Still, he never called himself king. There was no word for that yet. But people began to kneel, not out of fear, but from awe. Awe of a man who seemed to have no master but the stone beneath his feet. He taught them to listen, to the earth, to the wind, to the patterns of fire, and above all, to the silence between things. Then one day the tremor came. The earth shook, not a violent quake, but a deep, rhythmic pulse, as though something ancient was waking. U-Kan-Lel walked into the hills alone. When he returned, he brought obsidian, blacker than night, sharper than any fong. He said nothing, but he began carving. The villagers watched as he and his closest followers dug into the ground. They carved channels, they hauled basalt, and they shaped something massive, so large it could not be seen at once. Took years. Entire generations of children grew up watching stone emerge from earth like a buried god. And when it was complete, the people gathered around it in silence. It was a head, immense, human but more, with helmet-like bands and a gaze so intense that birds refused to land on it. The people called it Face of Thunder, but those closest to U-Kan-Lel said it was him. Not a likeness, but his voice, frozen in basalt. Not a statue to be worshipped, a mirror, promise. It was the first of many. The era of wandering was over. The jungle now had walls. The people had names. The earth had memory. And U-Kan-Lel stood at the center, not as a conqueror, but as a conduit. He would not live forever, but his stone would. And in its silence, it would carry the heartbeat of a people who once had no king, and now had one carved into the bones of the world. And so, under the heavy sky of an unnamed age, among the slow rivers and green shadows, a civilization was born, not with war, not with writing, but with stone, with vision, with the unshakable stillness of a man who listened to the earth and heard it answer. His name was U-Kan-Lel, and this was the beginning. The first storms of the season came with a fury not seen in generations. The winds tore at the thatched roofs, and the rain fell not in drops but in sheets, curtains of water cascading from the heavens as though the gods themselves wept. Trees bent, rivers swelled, and the ground seemed to breathe beneath the feet of the people. But San Lorenzo stood. It stood because of U-Kan-Lel. He had foreseen the floods, not with prophecy but with precision. Channels had been dug months before, guided by his silent walks and gestures in the dirt. Reservoirs caught the excess water. Raised platforms remained dry, and at the highest point, where the great stone head sat unmoving in the tempest, fires burned. Somehow the flames survived the rain. To the people, this was more than wisdom. It was communion with forces beyond comprehension. They began to whisper stories, not of what he built, but of who he was. Some said he was born of the earth, others claimed he came from the stars. A few dared to believe he had no mother at all, that he was shaped from clay by the jaguar gods and breathed into life by the wind itself. But U-Kan-Lel never claimed divinity. He listened to their tales but never encouraged them. His power was not in claiming lineage to gods, but in his relentless pursuit of order, balance, and permanence. He did not rule with a staff or a throne. He ruled with geometry, with alignment, with stone. He introduced a calendar, not one written in glyphs, but in shadows. Stone markers placed carefully to measure the path of the sun, the return of the rains, the migration of birds. From these patterns came planting cycles, rituals, and the first festivals. The people began to live not just season by season, but in rhythm with the sky. And with time, they began to build more. Mounds rose where once there was only flatland. Stones were dragged for miles, shaped with tools of obsidian and jade, polished until they gleamed. Faces appeared, some human, some not. Jaguars with wide mouths, serpents with feathered wings. And at the heart of it all, always, a pair of eyes carved in basalt that seemed to watch not just the world, but through it. The children born in this new age did not remember the days of chaos. To them, U-Kan-Lel had always been there. As constant as the river, as unchanging as the moon. He was not a man. He was the pulse of their world. And yet, he remained among them. Not aloof but present. He taught by example. Dug when others dug. Hauled stone. Stood in the rain. Watched the stars. Some scholars today question his existence. They call him myth, a composite figure born from oral traditions and the anonymity of early civilization. But those who walk the ruins of San Lorenzo, who stand before the colossal heads and feel the silent pressure of their gaze, know better. There is something undeniable in the symmetry, in the precision of alignment, in the way water still flows through the ancient channels after thousands of years. This was not the work of a nameless collective. This was vision made manifest, and behind that vision a voice that did not shout. It whispered in basalt, in gravity, in design. U-Kan-Lel's story, if it was ever spoken in his time, was never written down. The Olmec left few texts. Their knowledge was etched into stone, not words. Their legacy is tactile, something you feel under your hands, not read in books. But the silence of their civilization is not absence. It is density, compression. Everything they were, reduced to symbols and forms that refuse to fade. Even the great head of San Lorenzo, battered by time, remains. His features are not stylized, but individual. A nose broken at the bridge, lips slightly parted, eyes that refuse to close. Archaeologists debate its purpose. Was it a monument, a warning, a representation of lineage? But among the people who still live near those rivers, there is no debate. They say it is U-Kan-Lel, and they do not question why his head alone remains. Because to them, the head is where the voice lives, not the voice of commands or decrees, but the voice of alignment, of silence understood, of truths too big for language. In the generations that followed, others would claim power. They would build higher mounds, erect larger cities. They would sculpt gods with more elaborate headdresses, develop glyphs and complex mathematics. But they would all build upon what U-Kan-Lel had shown, that power lies not in domination, but in structure. That the future begins when someone has the courage to shape the present. And so, long before the Maya charted the heavens, long before the Aztec raised their stone hearts to the sun, before Teotihuacan, before Tikal, before the calendars, before the blood altars and obsidian blades, there was a man, or something like one, and he showed a scattered people how to become a civilization. He walked among rivers, carved his soul into basalt, and taught his people to listen to the silence between storms. That silence still echoes. It echoes in the ruins, in the shadows of mounds swallowed by jungle, in the grooves of carved stone smoothed by centuries of rain. It echoes in the rhythm of the rainy season and the stillness of drought. It echoes when a child lifts a stone and wonders why it fits perfectly into the next. It is the echo of U-Kan-Lel, the first builder, the first listener, the first voice, not a god, not a king, but something older than both, a beginning. When a people learn to stack stone in the shape of the sky, they begin to remember the future. The Olmec were not born with maps or mathematics. They inherited nothing but weather and earth. But in the growing shadow of San Lorenzo's rising platforms, something extraordinary began to stir. It wasn't an empire. Not yet. It was rhythm, the steady, intentional rhythm of hands moving stone, of minds aligning purpose with design, of a people gathering around form not for shelter, but for meaning. At the center of that rhythm stood U-Kan-Lel. He was no longer a boy. His shoulders were broad now, his hands calloused from shaping basalt, his eyes carved deeper by wind and sun. Yet he carried the same silence as he had in youth, the silence that unnerved elders and comforted children. That silence now lived in every space he touched. He had no throne, no palace, but he had something greater, direction, and people followed it. Stone was the beginning. Where others saw obstacles, U-Kan-Lel saw language. He did not speak it aloud. He arranged it. Stones were chosen for their balance, their resonance, their resistance. They were not cut to serve human whim. They were placed to echo something older. When U-Kan-Lel built, he didn't invent. He revealed, as though these forms already existed somewhere beyond the eye. He was simply uncovering them. He began with the earthworks, leveling land not by domination, but through flow. Water was his compass. He studied how it curved, paused, carved. He mimicked its discipline. The first canals were shallow, but elegant. They turned flood into irrigation. The marshlands were no longer feared, they were harnessed. From them came harvests not just of maize and squash, but of fish, salt, clay, and thyme. And then came the stone alignments. Rows of basalt columns that pointed not toward glory, but toward sunrise. U-Kan-Lel seemed obsessed with light. He traced the way it changed the shape of shadows, how it marked seasons, how it split through clouds on specific days. His followers began to mark days by the length of shadow falling from a single pole in the central plaza. Over time, those shadows dictated rituals, gatherings, planting cycles. This was the quiet birth of order. Not through war, not through edict, through alignment. The people who gathered around him came from many rivers, many tongues. Some brought songs of jaguar spirits. Others carried obsidian from distant highlands, feathers from coasts, salt from the sea. They were not all alike, but in stone they found common ground. U-Kan-Lel did not demand unity. He created space for it. A plaza, open to sky and wind, framed by stone but not caged by it. And in that space something happened. Strangers began to trust each other. Children of different clans played under the same tree. Women wove fibers with shared patterns. Men once separated by dialect began to chant in rhythms that matched the sun. They began to bury their dead facing the same direction, toward the rising light. They shared food, shared tasks, shared silence. The basin that once held scattered groups had become a basin for belief. But still, U-Kan-Lel did not speak of power. He refused offerings of tribute. When someone brought him jaguar pelts or cacao beans in exchange for protection, he returned them. "This is not mine," he once said, or so the oral stories claim. "It belongs to the breath between us." That breath became sacred, not air, but space. The unseen pattern connecting stone, star, and skin. Then came the first fire circle. It began with a single ring of stones in the far side of the plaza. No one had seen U-Kan-Lel build it, but one morning it was there. 12 stones, equidistant, smooth, unadorned. He stood in the center at dawn, and as the first light hit the eastern stone, he lifted his hands and said nothing, just stood, still, watching. People joined him in silence. They didn't understand, but they felt. Later, the fire was lit. It was not a bonfire. It was deliberate, slow. The flames fed by copal resin, a sweet-smelling sap that sent white smoke into the sky. That smoke curled and climbed and disappeared directly above them, straight up, perfect column. People gasped. Children pointed. The sky accepted their breath. And from that moment forward, the plaza became the mouth of the world. That night, stars returned in full clarity. Not a single cloud. The people took it as a sign. U-Kan-Lel took it as alignment. From then on, the plaza was used not just for gathering, but for marking time. Stones were added to track lunar cycles, equinoxes, eclipses. Priests emerged, not as mouthpieces of gods, but as keepers of rhythm. They read shadows, recorded harvests, watched bird migrations. Slowly, the formless became form. The invisible gained weight. And yet, U-Kan-Lel still refused the title of king. But a people cannot live without symbols. And so, they gave him one. From basalt drawn up the river, they carved a new head. This one was different, larger, as not just deep, but focused, gazing slightly to the left of center, toward where the sun would rise at solstice. The lips were parted in a whisper. The helmeted crown held 3 ridges. One for earth, one for water, one for breath. Took over a year to complete. When finished, it was placed not in the plaza, but at the edge of the cultivated land. A boundary marker between the built world and the wild. U-Kan-Lel did not attend the ceremony. But that night, he was seen walking alone around it, touching the ridges. The next morning, he marked a circle in the dirt around it and left it alone. No one dared cross the line, not because of law, because of understanding. This was not a monument. It was a turning point, and turning points bring change. News of San Lorenzo spread. Traders spoke of a place where stones sang, where rivers obeyed, where people walked together without fear. Curiosity became pilgrimage. Outsiders arrived not to conquer, but to learn. Some brought maps, others brought metal, still others brought questions. U-Kan-Lel received them all the same with listening. He gave no speeches, but he walked them through the patterns. He let them feel the difference between chaos and rhythm. Some stayed, some left changed, but not all change was welcome. Whispers began in the eastern hills. Leaders from rival regions began to fear the influence of San Lorenzo, not because of armies but because their own people began asking, "Why not us too?" The fear of questions led to the birth of resistance. Not swords, but suspicion, isolation. Trade routes grew tense. Messengers returned late. Gifts began to disappear en route. U-Kan-Lel responded not with defense, but with construction. He began building long causeways, paths of stone that stretched over marshland, connecting outposts with precision. These were not just roads. They were veins, carriers of thought. Along them came goods, yes, but also ideas, forms, songs, rituals, identity, the Olmec identity, not of blood, not of conquest, of shape, of balance, and that identity, once felt, could not be unlearned. The people of San Lorenzo began calling themselves Tubacu, a word that meant those who build in time. It wasn't ethnic. It wasn't tribal. It was a choice, a way of seeing the world. To be Tubacu meant to place every stone with intention, to see breath not just in bodies, but in space between structures. It was belief made practical. U-Kan-Lel, now older, moved less, but his influence grew. Children studied the stars because they wanted to. Adults offered extra hands not out of duty, but out of joy. The city did not grow from command. It expanded because people needed to express what they felt. Stone was not labor, it was language, and as the city grew, so did its understanding of itself. New forms emerged: stone altars, ball courts, platforms with embedded magnetite. Buildings aligned not just with solstice, but with nodes of underground water. People noticed that the plaza echoed differently at certain times of day, and began designing spaces to amplify sound. Whispering galleries, chants that could be heard hundreds of feet away without shouting. These were not tricks. They were worship, not of a god, a pattern. And in that worship they began to dream. Not dreams of expansion or conquest, but dreams of permanence, of eternity, of a world that could outlast weather, wind, and forgetting. That dream had a face. It was not smiling. It was not fierce. It was not beautiful. It was steady. It was carved in basalt. And it bore the silence of a man who had once listened to the river and heard the shape of forever. In the long hush of dawn, when mist curled like incense above the river's edge and the jungle stirred with the soft chitter of awakening life, the people of San Lorenzo beheld something they had never seen before. Rising from the plaza like a god unburied, a massive stone head cast its solemn gaze across the valley. His face, broad and heavy-lidded, stared with unflinching stillness. Its lips, thick and compressed, whispered nothing, but seemed to listen to everything. It was the face of U-Kan-Lel, or so the people believed. No name was carved. No inscription adorned its base. It was not meant to explain, it was meant to endure. And it would. The carving of the first colossal head had begun in silence, far from the eyes of the public. U-Kan-Lel had chosen a site upriver, where a solitary basalt outcrop had emerged after a landslide, its black surface veined with quartz and cooled to a toughness unlike any other. To most, it was an unworkable boulder. To U-Kan-Lel, it was the seed of a voice. It took weeks to shape the path through the jungle just to reach the stone. Then months to begin carving, using tools of jade, obsidian, wood, and fire, stone on stone, spark against silence. The work was patient, deliberate. U-Kan-Lel did not command an army of laborers. He chose a handful of builders, those who understood not just how to shape stone but how to read it. Each strike of the tool was a question. Each curve, a response. It is said they never worked when the air was wrong, when the humidity was high or the birds stopped singing. They waited for balance, for alignment, and when the weather permitted, they resumed, as though the stone itself dictated its transformation. It took 2 full harvest cycles to complete. Transporting the head was another act of devotion. Using river barges and wooden rollers, guided by chance and calculated pulleys, the builders moved the enormous form mile by mile, never letting it touch the ground except when resting on sacred branches laid in ritual patterns. The final ascent into San Lorenzo was not marked by trumpets or crowds. It was marked by breathless awe. The moment it reached the plaza, the people went silent, because the head looked alive, not with flesh, not with warmth, but with something deeper, recognition. The face bore no specific identity, yet every wrinkle, every asymmetry, every groove held familiarity. It was not an image of U-Kan-Lel in the way a mask reflects a person. It was U-Kan-Lel's stillness made permanent. To those who knew him, the resemblance was impossible to deny. The wide nose, the strong brow, the curve of the jaw. But it wasn't just his face. It was his presence, his weight, his refusal to move, even as the world bent around him. The people called it the listener. They gathered before it not to offer tribute, but to speak into its silence. Farmers whispered wishes for rain. Mothers prayed for safe births. Children left pebbles shaped like eyes. It became a mirror, not of vanity, but of hope. They believed it carried their words to the sky. And when the rains came as requested, or when the jaguars stayed away, or when 2 harvests bore more fruit than expected, they credited the stone. But U-Kan-Lel never encouraged worship. He reminded them, the stone does not give, it remembers. That was its power, not to grant, but to hold. And yet, something shifted after the head was raised. For the first time, outsiders began to tremble. The presence of San Lorenzo grew heavier in the minds of distant leaders. It was no longer just a city, it was a force. A name whispered between traders and messengers. The city of the head. The place where stone watches. Where the king never speaks, but his face never blinks. Pilgrims began to arrive not just for trade or knowledge, but for revelation. They came from mountains, from coasts, from far-reaching valleys where the name Olmec had not yet taken hold. They walked barefoot, carrying no gifts, offering only breath. They knelt before the head. They waited for visions. Some claimed to have seen dreams more vivid under its gaze. Others felt nothing, but returned home changed. And so the stone head became a threshold between man and mystery. As San Lorenzo expanded, new structures rose around it. Ceremonial mounds, processional walkways, altars shaped like open jaws. But none drew more reverence than that single face of stone. It was not tallest. It was not adorned. But it was first. It was the axis. The builders, inspired by its power, began replicating its form. Not identically, but rhythmically. Other heads appeared, each with distinct features. Some wore helmets. Some bore scars. Some had eyes narrow with contemplation, others wide with fury. They were not images of one man. They were representations of presence. It is here that a new class emerged, the stonekeepers. Not priests, not warriors, but guardians of geometry. They maintained the alignments of heads and altars. They tracked how shadow touched cheekbones at solstice, how moss grew on the western ridge, how rain dripped from the nose of the statues at equinox. They did not interpret. They recorded, and in their silence they built memory. It was the birth of history, not in language but in placement. Meanwhile, U-Kan-Lel grew older. His movements slowed. His hair thinned, but his presence did not fade. He became more elusive, appearing only when balance was in question. He would walk among the mounds, touch the soil, then disappear for days. Sometimes he would return with new stones, small, patterned, magnetic. He would place them beneath structures, in corners, beneath platforms. No one knew why, but tremors ceased. Water flowed smoother. Birds nested closer. It was as if he was building not just a city but a circuit, a living system of energy and stillness. But not all admired the stillness. Far to the north, leaders of rival centers watched with growing unease. Their traders returned with stories not of conquest, but of architecture, of stone heads that listened, of a city that could shape the sky, and worst of all, a king who did not speak, but whose silence moved thousands. Jealousy brewed, not in weapons, but in mimicry. Other cities tried to build their own heads. Some were crude, some massive but lifeless. They copied the shape but not the breath. They failed to understand what San Lorenzo had learned, that power is not in replication but in resonance. U-Kan-Lel said little about these imitations, but he did one thing. He carved a second head. This one smaller, simpler, but when placed beside the first, it changed everything. Their angles, just slightly misaligned, created an echo, not of sound but of form. Shadows that once stretched straight now bent. Reflections in water broke into double images. The plaza began to shift its rhythm. People noticed, and then came the whisper. He is building a council, not of people, of presence. Each head, a voice. Each placement, a statement, but not one of power, of perspective. And so, over the next decade, the number of heads grew. Some stood alone in fields, others at crossroads, some embedded into platforms. They did not form a line. They did not form a grid. They formed a pattern too large for eyes, too slow for time. A geometry of memory. And in that memory, San Lorenzo thrived. Children grew up with stone faces watching over them, not as enforcers but as reminders. Traders brought exotic materials not in tribute, but in exchange for stillness. Cities far away began sending envoys not to negotiate, but to witness. And when they returned, they built their plazas a little differently. Their mounds faced new directions. Their stories adopted new rhythms. The influence of U-Kan-Lel moved not through conquest, but through shape. But shape does not protect. Storms still came. Crops still failed. And now, in the distance, a new kind of whisper emerged. Of resistance. Of cities that saw San Lorenzo not as a teacher, but as a threat. Not because it demanded allegiance, but because it made them irrelevant. In the north, a coalition of tribal leaders began uniting. Not under a king, but under a fear. That stillness was spreading. That silence was stronger than shouting, that a stone face could dethrone them without ever raising a blade. And so they sharpened theirs. The war had not yet come, but the air had changed. U-Kan-Lel knew. He began walking again. Longer distances. Into the hills. Into the caves. Into the silence of wind over basalt. And one day he returned with a new form. A mask. Not for his face, but for the city. A mask carved from greenstone, polished until it held no reflection. It was flat, symmetrical, empty. He placed it in the center of the plaza, facing the largest head. And then he waited. The people came. They stared. And in the silence between the stone and the mask, they understood. This was not the end. It was preparation. For what? Even U-Kan-Lel could not say. But the stone knew, and it was listening. The jungle is never silent, not truly. Even in the darkest hours, when the moon is hidden and the wind lies still, there is the murmur of life. The chirp of insects, the slither of unseen coils, the breath of roots pushing quietly through soil. But in that year, the jungle fell into an unnatural hush. The birds ceased their morning songs. The frogs stayed hidden. And the trees, which once danced in the wind, stood still like witnesses holding their breath. San Lorenzo felt it too. The river, normally rhythmic in its flow, began to slow. Fish swam deeper. The rain came out of season, short bursts of fury followed by long, arid silences. Crops grew unevenly. The maze curled at the edges. The air hung heavy, and in the skies above the mountains to the north, a strange cloud formed, flat and unmoving, like a lid pressed over the world. Whispers began to circulate. Something was coming. The people looked to U-Kan-Lel. He did not speak. Instead, he walked again and again, tracing a spiral around the central plaza, his staff pressing into the soil with each deliberate step. On the seventh day, he stopped. He placed his palm on the largest stone head and whispered a single word. No one heard it, but the next day he ordered the plaza to be cleared. Not for ceremony. For war. It was the first time the people of San Lorenzo had ever seen him raise his hand. Not in welcome, but in warning. Far to the north, the coalition of rival leaders had become more than an idea. It was now a presence. Their messengers had stopped coming. Trade routes once filled with salted fish and obsidian blades had dried up. Scouts whispered of gatherings in the highlands. Bonfires that burned too long, smoke signals that repeated in aggressive rhythms. Even birds flew wide circles around those hills. They were not just uniting against San Lorenzo, they were preparing to destroy it. But U-Kan-Lel did not build walls. He did not stockpile weapons. He did not train an army. Instead, he gathered the builders, and he told them to carve jaguars. Dozens of them. Small, large, crouching, leaping, some with eyes open, others with jaws wide in silent roar. Not decorations, not totems, symbols. He placed them at the boundaries of the city, buried them halfway in the soil, their backs arched, their paws splayed. They were not meant to be seen fully. They were meant to be sensed. To a stranger approaching San Lorenzo, the message was clear. This place has teeth. The jaguar in Olmec belief was not just predator, it was paradox. A creature of shadow and power, of night and vision. It moved unseen. It struck without warning. But more than that, it represented the crossing between worlds, the human and the divine, the material and the spirit. By placing the jaguar at the city's edges, U-Kan-Lel was not just warning enemies. He was invoking balance. But balance had already shifted. One morning, before sunrise, a scream echoed through the southern village. A hunting party, returning late from the marshes, had vanished. Only a trail of blood remained, no bodies, no signs of struggle, just absence. The next day, a stone marker at the edge of a distant farm was found broken in half, cleanly, like it had been struck by something far stronger than human hands. Fear crept in. Some demanded weapons. Others begged for ritual. U-Kan-Lel offered neither. Instead, he gathered the oldest among them, the ones who remembered the days before San Lorenzo. He walked with them into the jungle. Not far, just far enough to feel the old world again. The unshaped world. There, in a circle of ceiba trees, he drew a symbol in the dirt. A jaguar inside a spiral. Then he returned alone. That night, the rain returned not in droplets but in waves. Sheets of water pounding the plaza, flooding the fields, crashing over canals that had never before overflowed. The people ran for shelter. Fires went out. Statues cracked. The river churned with silt and branches and the dead. It was the first true flood in generations. But in the morning, San Lorenzo still stood. The platforms held. The canals, though battered, redirected water. And the central plaza, where the stone heads waited, was dry, completely, as though the storm had danced around it. Some said U-Kan-Lel had spoken to the storm, that he had offered it something the rest of the world could not. A boundary, a breath, a rhythm. Others said he had become the storm, that the flood was not punishment, but purification. But U-Kan-Lel said nothing. Instead, he knelt beside one of the jaguar carvings, now half submerged in mud, and pressed his forehead to its back. The people watched. They followed. They began to build again, not with fear, but with clarity. Walls were reinforced. Causeways widened. Homes raised on stilts. The city became less ceremonial, more alive. Its arteries pulsed with renewed purpose. And then the enemy came. Not in legions. In silence. The scouts were the first to vanish. Then border farms found their crops burned. At night, drums echoed from the hills, not rhythms of celebration, but of intent. And one morning, a carved jaguar was found beheaded, his head placed backward, facing the city. The message was unmistakable. They would not negotiate. They would erase. The city gathered. In the plaza, around the great heads, thousands stood, men, women, children, elders, all waiting. They did not ask for leadership. They looked to the stone, and U-Kan-Lel walked between them. He placed a single obsidian blade at the base of the largest head. Not a weapon, a mirror. Its surface, polished, reflected not the face of a warrior, but of a people. Then he spoke. For the first time in memory, he raised his voice and said, "This is not the place we built to hide. It is the breath we made from silence. If they strike the wind." The people did not cheer. They nodded and began to prepare, not with walls, with presence. Statues were moved not to defend, but to confront. New heads were placed along the main path into the city, each facing the hills. Not angry, watching. Builders laid down lines of magnetite, powdered and spread across the ground, forming shapes only visible from above. Snakes, spirals, eyes. Patterns meant to disorient, to unsettle. And then they waited. The attack came on a new moon, a night without stars. They moved quickly. Silent warriors in dark paint, blades of stone and bone, feet bare and hearts burning with the promise of destruction. But the city did not resist. It received them. The causeways led them inward, but their feet stumbled. The shapes beneath them shifted in moonlight. Their compasses spun. Their torches flickered. And as they reached the central plaza, they stopped. The heads were there, dozens, looming, silent, watching. And in the silence, something cracked. Not stone. Will. Some dropped their weapons. Others froze. And then the wind rose. Not a storm. A voice. Not from U-Kan-Lel. From the stone. The plaza echoed with a sound none could name. Not chant. Not scream. Just resonance. Like the jungle itself remembered what it had forgotten. The invaders fled, not all, but enough. Those who stayed behind dropped to their knees and wept. No blood was spilled. No blades crossed. But San Lorenzo had won. Not by force. By presence. The next morning, U-Kan-Lel placed his hand on the mask in the center of the plaza. Cracked. Down the center. Cleanly. And he said, "It is time to become visible." The city changed after that. No longer hidden. No longer humble. It was still quiet. But it knew what it was. And the world began to know it too. Because now the jaguar had shown its teeth. And nothing would ever be the same. In the silence that followed the storm and the retreat of war, San Lorenzo exhaled. It was not a victory celebrated with feasting or drums. It was a victory felt in the soil, moist, intact, sacred. The people walked differently now. Not with fear, but with the awareness that their city was no longer a hidden rhythm in the jungle. It had become a pulse that others could hear, and some could not ignore. But while the stone heads continued to stand in quiet vigilance, and while the builders repaired what little damage had been done, U-Kan-Lel's eyes turned away from his own city. Not in dismissal, in preparation. He had begun to see the signs. The river no longer danced with the same freedom. The rains came heavier, but shorter. The harvests, once abundant and reliable, now arrived with strangeness. Some too early, some too late. The breath of the land was shifting. Something beneath them was moving. San Lorenzo, for all its beauty, was built near the edge of balance. Its intricate system of canals and reservoirs could only carry the weight of the world for so long. And U-Kan-Lel, in his quiet, had already begun the most difficult work of all, the work of letting go. Not out of failure, out of foresight. He began walking south alone at first, but soon others followed. He crossed rivers, waded through marshes, and climbed into new terrain, where the soil turned red and black, where the air smelled of salt and cinnamon, and where the earth, when struck, echoed like a drum. It was here that he stopped. Here, in the heart of an untouched valley, bordered by soft hills and guarded by the cries of birds no one in San Lorenzo had ever heard. He placed a stone on the ground. Not carved, not marked, just placed. And then he returned. When he came back to San Lorenzo, he did not call a council. He went to the plaza. He sat beneath the largest head. And he waited. The people gathered, sensing the change. He told them nothing of disaster, nothing of collapse. He spoke only of rhythm, of how even the heart, strong and steady, must pause between beats, of how breath is not only in the inhale but the release. And then he said, "We are not meant to root. We are meant to ripple." He told them the truth. The land could no longer carry what they were becoming. Not because they were too many, because they were too still. The water would rise, the soil would crack, the jungle would reclaim. Not as punishment, as cycle. The elders protested, the builders wept, but the children, born after the jaguar's roar, understood. They had seen a city speak without weapons. They knew that movement was not weakness. It was memory in motion. So they began again, but this time not in opposition to San Lorenzo. In continuation, U-Kan-Lel did not demand an exodus. He proposed an extension, a second breath, a second heart, and he called the new place not by a name of conquest, but by a word meaning offering. That place would one day be called La Venta. It began as a single mound, raised not with grand ambition, but with care. The earth was mixed with colored clay, black volcanic ash, and powdered shell. It was shaped into a gentle slope facing east, toward the morning light. No heads were placed there yet, only one marker, a thin steely carved with a spiral that bent inward, as if swallowing its own beginning. Builders came slowly. Some stayed behind in San Lorenzo. Others moved south with songs in their chests and new tools in hand. They did not rebuild the old city. They listened to the new land. They observed how water pooled, how wind pressed against the hill, how birds flew in broken lines above the trees. And from those observations, they began to shape a new rhythm. La Venta did not rise quickly. It emerged like memory, layer by layer, each stratum holding pigment, stone, intention. Jade was buried in lines. Obsidian blades were placed beneath doorways. Even the paths between structures were drawn not straight, but curved, to mimic the flow of blood. For that was the metaphor now. If San Lorenzo was breath, La Venta would be blood. The life force of a people learning to move. And in this life force, a new symbol began to appear. The maize stalk. It had always been sacred, but now it became central. U-Kan-Lel began carving maize not as food, but as a spine, a line connecting heaven to earth. A vertical axis. Atop it, flames. Beneath it, roots shaped like open hands. The people began painting their homes with this image. They chanted to it at dusk. They offered seeds not as tribute, but as continuity. This was not a city of stone alone. It was a city of fertility, of offering. But blood, too, is not only nourishment. It is sacrifice. And La Venta began to embrace that truth. The first ritual came not with drama, but with dusk. A drought had settled over the valley, 3 moons without rain. The crops bent in surrender. The rivers whispered low. And then one child died suddenly of fever. A second followed. The people feared they had chosen wrongly. U-Kan-Lel said nothing. He walked to the hill. He built a fire. And then, with the oldest blade of obsidian, the one placed beneath the first stone head, he drew a line across his own arm. Not deeply, but enough to let the blood fall into the flames. The smoke turned white, then green, then vanished. And that night the rain returned. Came gently, not a storm, a mist, a blessing. From that day forward, the people understood. Blood was not punishment. It was renewal. The land needed remembering. And remembering sometimes required pain. So they offered, not in frenzy, in rhythm, small cuts, drops of blood into fire, into earth, into water, and La Venta flourished. New mounds rose not for defense but for ascent. Platforms were shaped like eyes, with pools in the center to reflect the stars. Walkways aligned with constellations only visible in the wet season. Even the houses were built in clusters of 4: earth, fire, water, breath. U-Kan-Lel, now ancient, watched from the shadows. He no longer led. He walked, spoke rarely, but when he did, the builders stopped. The children sat cross-legged, and the sky, it seemed, leaned closer. One day he gathered the builders for a final task. Pyramid. Not the largest, but the first to hold not a burial, not a platform, but a chamber of resonance. Inside it, he asked for a single chamber to be carved, not large, not deep. Just wide enough for one voice to echo 3 times before fading. He stood inside it once, whispered, listened, then nodded. They sealed it. That was his last command. Weeks later, he disappeared. Some say he walked into the jungle. Others say he entered the river. One child claimed he saw him rise into the clouds. But when they opened the resonance chamber years later, they found a single object, piece of maize, wrapped in cloth stained red, and beside it, carved into the stone, the blood of the earth is not death. It is the memory of growth. And with that, U-Kan-Lel was gone, but not lost. His breath still lingered in San Lorenzo. His blood still ran through La Venta, and his silence, his impossible eternal silence, echoed now not in one city, but in 2, like lungs, breathing together, across time, across storm, across stone. The fire never died in La Venta. Even as the wind changed and the clouds returned, even as years passed and children became elders, the flame in the heart of the city burned with a quiet resolve. It was not a bonfire. It was not meant to warm. It did not dance wildly or roar. It flickered in a stone bowl at the center of a sacred court, one that had been carved to follow the sun's path, and one whose walls were polished until they caught the light like mirrors of obsidian. This fire was tended every morning before the first bird called, and every evening just after the last shadow disappeared. It was not a ritual. It was a heartbeat, a memory set alight. By the time the people realized they had not seen U-Kan-Lel in many moons, the city had already begun to transform without him. Not through forgetfulness, but through fulfillment. His absence was not a void. It was a signal. The silence he had always carried was now their own. His breath had become theirs, and they moved with a kind of confidence that did not need instruction. They didn't wonder where he had gone. They understood that he had never planned to stay forever. He was not a ruler. He was a rhythm, one that had taught them how to listen to the land and, in doing so, to themselves. The builders of La Venta had grown bolder. They no longer looked north to San Lorenzo for comparison. Their dreams stretched further now, not in size, but in depth. They began to think not just of structures that stood above the ground, but of spaces that tunneled beneath it. Subterranean passages, hidden chambers, sacred alignments buried in clay and ash. They began building not just with stone and earth, but with intention sculpted into memory. And then one of them dreamed of a pyramid. It did not come with fanfare or vision. It was a quiet idea, sketched first in the dirt during a summer evening, after a long day of clearing trees along the riverbank. A child had noticed that during the solstice, the sun did not just rise in the east. It struck a certain hilltop with a beam of light so precise that the leaves seemed to ignite. It was not fire, but it was revelation. The builders watched this for 3 years, measuring the angle of light with cords, bones, and the shadows of upright poles. The line of fire came without fail, and so they chose the hill. They called it the back of the snake. It was not tall, but it was ancient. A rise of earth shaped like a slumbering beast, long and coiled, with a rounded peak that had resisted erosion for centuries. The elders said it had once been the nesting place of a thunderbird. The builders didn't argue. They began hauling stone. The construction was slow and reverent. Every layer was laid with a specific type of earth, one red, one yellow, one black. The clay was mixed with charcoal, crushed shell, and mica that glittered faintly in the dark. They carried materials from miles away, not because they had to, but because the journey gave the stones meaning. Each was chosen for tone, weight, and resonance. It was said that if you struck the base of the pyramid with an open palm, the echo would sound like a heartbeat buried beneath the earth. At the summit, they did not build a temple. They left it flat, platform open to the sky. And in the center of that platform, they placed a bowl. Not carved, not painted, just perfectly round. Made from the same basalt that had birthed the first stone heads. The builders said nothing when it was done. They waited. And on the solstice, as the sun crested the horizon, the light struck the edge of the pyramid, climbed its slope, and ignited the bowl without flame. Just heat, pure and sudden, reflected off a mirror the builders had hidden below. The fire leapt up. Not high, but alive. The city gathered in silence. No words were spoken. None were needed. They had built a pyramid not to reach the gods, but to reveal the fire already within the world. It became known as the Pyramid of Fire. From that day on, the pyramid was tended like a living being. Builders maintained its symmetry, children swept its paths, and elders offered the first kernels of maize to the flame before every meal. No sacrifices were made, no blood spilled. It was not a place of death. It was a place of connection. And as the fire grew, so did the stories. They began to say that U-Kan-Lel had not disappeared, but had become the fire itself. That every flicker was his breath, every smoke spiral his eye. They claimed that if you sat near the pyramid at dawn, you could hear him speak. Not in words, but in warmth. They did not worship him. They remembered him. Then came the travelers. First from the mountains, then from across the sea. Men and women who spoke strange tongues, carried different tools, painted their faces in unfamiliar ways. Some came seeking knowledge. Others came looking for power. All were drawn by rumor. Rumors of a fire that could never be extinguished. Rumors of stone that could remember. Rumors of a king who had left no tomb because he had never truly died. Some visitors were welcomed. Some were turned away. But all who came to La Venta felt it. An atmosphere of stillness, dense and alive, as if the very soil beneath their feet hummed with the memory of something vast and unseen. The stories spread faster than the traders. And soon, leaders from distant lands sent envoys not just with offerings, but with questions. They wanted to know the secret of balance, of alignment, of how a people with no army had defended themselves with stone and silence. The builders of La Venta responded not with pride, but with patience. They shared stories. They shared maps of stars. They shared the rhythm of planting, the chants of dawn, the rituals of fire. But they never shared the fire itself. The flame on the pyramid was theirs, not because it belonged to them, but because it had become them. Still, not all who came respected this. One ruler, bold and loud, arrived with guards and gifts. He offered jade, gold, captives. In exchange, he asked for the fire, to take a coal, to bring it to his own land, to build a pyramid of his own. The elders refused. Politely, he returned the next day. Insisted. They refused again. The third day, he threatened. That night he left, empty-handed. The following morning, the fire on the pyramid burned brighter than ever. Some said the gods were watching. Others said U-Kan-Lel had returned. But none questioned the flame again. And yet, within La Venta, another kind of fire was growing. Not of rebellion, of awakening. Younger builders began questioning. Not the past, but the future. They loved U-Kan-Lel. They honored the pyramid. But they began to wonder, was alignment enough? Was stillness all there was? They spoke in circles, sketched new shapes, less symmetrical, more dynamic. They imagined pyramids that twisted, altars that moved, plazas that pulsed with water and light. The elders listened, did not scold, did not silence. They simply said, U-Kan-Lel taught us to begin. He never told us where to stop. So the new builders began again. Not by tearing down the past, by adding to it. They constructed a series of mounds north of the pyramid, small, spiraling, layered in obsidian dust. These mounds did not align with the sun. They aligned with the movement of Venus. The builders claimed they could track eclipses before they happened. They were not always right, but they were always trying. The city began to breathe differently. Not faster, wider. Ideas flowed like rivers in wet season. The maize still grew. The fire still burned. But now the pyramid was no longer alone. It was part of a constellation, a network of meaning, a geometry of becoming. And in that becoming, the people of La Venta felt something new. Not pride, not power, permission to change, to grow, to carry the fire forward, not to preserve it, to become it. And so, on the 100th anniversary of the Pyramid of Fire's ignition, the people did not hold a feast. They walked to the pyramid, one by one, in silence, and placed at its base a single object, not offerings of wealth, but memory. A child placed a toy carved of bone. A mother placed a feather from a bird she had rescued. An elder placed a bowl of ashes from a fire that had warmed her firstborn. And when all was placed, the people gathered around the flame, and said nothing, because the fire spoke enough. And in its warmth, the memory of U-Kan-Lel still burned, not as a man, not as a king, but as a pattern, a breath, a flame carried forward in the shape of stone and story. There are seasons that don't belong to the calendar, seasons not born of sun or rain, but of restlessness. They move like a hush before the cry, like the tension in a bowstring stretched too long. They announce themselves not with storm clouds or cracked earth, but with a subtle change in the way the wind breathes through trees. In La Venta, the wind began to shift, not in strength, in direction. It came from the north now, cold and uncertain, brushing against the backs of the people instead of their faces. It tangled the smoke from the pyramid of fire. It disturbed the sleep of elders. Birds flew in odd, broken formations. The frogs sang at the wrong hour. And beneath it all was a rhythm that didn't match the one carved into the city's heart. For the first time in memory, the builders argued. It began with placement. One of the younger artisans, obsessed with the movement of Venus and the interplay of water and sound, proposed realigning a sacred altar near the northern causeway. It had stood for decades, untouched, a marker of the solstice and the memory of U-Kan-Lel's final days. He claimed the stars had shifted, that the future lay not in preservation, but in adaptation. The elders refused, not out of dogma, but of caution. Some patterns, they said, must remain, but caution began to feel like hesitation, and hesitation like resistance. The younger builders gathered. They called themselves the breath speakers, not in rebellion, but in renewal. They held ceremonies near the marshlands, built new mounds shaped like water drops and spiral shells. Their architecture was dynamic, curved walls, floating platforms, altars made to catch wind and transform it into sound. Their monuments did not remember the past. They sang of what could be. La Venta watched, listened, and began to divide, not with violence, with intention. Some continued the rituals of the fire. Others traced the paths of planets, believing that U-Kan-Lel had passed through the sky and would return when Venus eclipsed the sun. Traders brought stories of new cities rising in distant jungles, places that did not kneel before stone heads or fire pyramids, but danced around pools of colored water and carved their gods from air. And so came the first refusal. A group of breath speakers declined to participate in the solstice ceremony atop the pyramid of fire. They claimed the fire no longer aligned with the stars, that it echoed an old rhythm, that its heartbeat was slowing. The elders were stunned, not by disagreement but by its clarity. This was no longer divergence. It was defiance. The city held its breath, not in fear, in anticipation. Then one morning the fire was gone. The stone bowl on the pyramid summit was cold. Ashes scattered across the platform, carried by the wind that now blew with sudden strength. No footprints, no signs of sabotage, just silence. The people gathered, stunned. Children wept, elders knelt, but the breath speakers stood in quiet recognition. "This is the beginning," one of them whispered. The elders relit the flame. The fire returned. But something in its glow had changed. It no longer flickered with certainty. It danced with doubt. That night a meeting was called. Beneath the gaze of the oldest stele, the builders and speakers of La Venta gathered. No blades, no accusations, just breath. The elders spoke first of memory, of foundation, of the responsibility to hold the silence U-Kan-Lel had given them. The breath speakers replied, not with mockery, but with conviction. They believed that U-Kan-Lel had never meant for La Venta to remain still, that his disappearance was not an ending, but a challenge. If breath must move, they said, then fire must yield. The debate stretched until dawn. When the sun rose, there was no agreement, only a decision, a separation. The breath speakers would leave, not in exile, in evolution. They would journey west, toward the highlands, to a land of mist and obsidian cliffs. They would build not from symmetry, but from sound. They would chase the voice of the wind until it became shape. They asked for one gift, a single ember from the pyramid of fire. The elders refused, and so, the breath speakers left in silence. But the wind followed them. In the weeks that followed, La Venta began to unravel, not in destruction, but in questions. Children asked why the fire needed to be fed, why the pyramid remained closed to new forms, why the builders walked the same paths year after year. The elders tried to answer, but the wind carried their words away. And then came the storm, unlike any the city had known. The clouds did not arrive gradually. They dropped like a curtain. The wind did not howl, it screamed. Trees bent in pain. Water surged through the canals in reverse. Birds flew into stone. The pyramid shook. And the fire, once unshakable, was extinguished again. This time there was no silence. The city cried, but not in grief, in awakening. When the storm passed, the city gathered. No one called a meeting. No one led. The people simply arrived. At the pyramid, at the plaza, at the edge of what had been and what might be. A child stepped forward. She held a bowl. Inside it, a single ember. Where it had come from, no one knew. She placed it in the stone basin. The fire caught, and this time it burned differently. Not bright, but deep, like a heartbeat beneath the surface of the world. The elders said nothing. The children knelt, and La Venta began again. Not in rebellion, in breath. And across the western horizon, where the wind moved freely and the clouds broke in spirals, the breath speakers built a temple of air. No stone, just arches of light and channels of sound. They called it Tulan, the place where winds are born. And they, too, remembered U-Kan-Lel, not as a figure, as a current, a force that moved through time not to settle, but to stir. And so the people of the lowlands and the highlands, of stone and wind, of fire and breath, began to live in parallel. Two rhythms, two forms, both born of silence, both still listening, for the return of a voice that had never truly left. No one remembered the first time the mask appeared. It was simply there, resting on a polished stone at the eastern edge of La Venta, facing the morning sun. It was made of greenstone, deep, rich, layered with veins of white, and carved with such symmetry that the face it bore seemed neither young nor old, neither male nor female. It did not smile. It did not frown. It simply existed, waiting, watching. They called it the Breathless One. The builders said it had never been carved, that it had grown, that the jungle itself had shaped it over centuries, using wind and time and the hands of the forgotten. It was not offered in ceremony, not unveiled in ritual. It was not claimed by any lineage, priest, or artisan. And that was what made it sacred. It was U-Kan-Lel, or perhaps it was what he had become. The mask became a mystery without an answer, and a truth without a question. No one touched it, not even the elders. Children would sit before it, whispering dreams. Traders would leave feathers and beads near its base. Some nights it glowed faintly in the moonlight. Others, It vanished into the shadows as if swallowed by the land. But the mask was only the beginning. A wave of remembrance began to ripple through La Venta, not of events or names, but of presence, of something lingering just beyond explanation. Dreams became more vivid. The builders began to hum unfamiliar melodies while laying stone, tunes that matched the rhythm of the wind or the fall of water against clay. Old structures began to shift ever so slightly. Stones moved by a hand no one saw. Carvings appeared in places untouched for years. And then, one morning, a new stele stood in the plaza. No one knew who had carved it. It bore a spiral etched into the chest of a faceless figure. Not a king, not a god, just a form, a vessel. At the base of the stele, 7 small holes had been drilled. When the wind passed through, it sang a chord. Low, steady, familiar. It was the voice of the mask. The people of La Venta did not panic. They did not proclaim miracles or create new orders. They listened. That had always been their gift. Listening not with ears, but with the body, with silence. And the more they listened, the more they understood. U-Kan-Lel was not a man in the past. He was the pattern in the present. And the mask was a door, not to another world, to another way of seeing. They began building again, not with the urgency of expansion, but with the intimacy of memory. Small shrines emerged along pathways, shaped like open hands. Pools were dug in the shape of eyes, filled with rainwater to reflect the constellations. Even the marketplace changed. Traders arranged their goods in spirals, not rows, aligning with the paths of the wind. Songs were composed not to be sung aloud, but to be hummed beneath the breath. The city became softer, and yet more awake. But across the horizon, others began to take notice. Far from La Venta, new powers were rising, cities with sharper edges, leaders who spoke not of balance but of dominion. These cities did not listen to the wind. They listened to the beat of drums. Their pyramids were taller, their sacrifices louder. Their warriors painted their faces with the colors of conquest. And they began to hear whispers of La Venta, a city where fire lived without fuel, where a man had become memory, where a mask sang in the wind. To these leaders, this was heresy. Control required clarity. And the idea of U-Kan-Lel, a king who had no throne, whose silence led generations, whose image could not be owned, was a threat. So they sent emissaries, not to learn, to absorb. The first emissaries arrived draped in gold and feathers, their words thick with flattery. They offered alliances, marriages, tribute, all in exchange for the mask. We wish only to carry your truth, they said, to honor your silence. The elders smiled, listened, refused. The emissaries returned with news. La Venta would not join, and so the cities sent soldiers. Small units first, scouts, spies, saboteurs. But La Venta had no army, no walls, no war drums, and that, more than anything, unsettled the invaders. They entered a city without fear, and found themselves surrounded by stillness. Streets curved in unfamiliar patterns. Pathways echoed their footsteps back at them. Voices seemed to follow without source. And at the edge of it all, the mask waited. Those who tried to approach it felt wind press against their skin. Not forcefully, but insistently. Some said the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. Others felt watched not by eyes, but by memory itself. None of them touched it. None of them returned. The leaders grew impatient. They sent armies. And this time, La Venta did not wait. They did not raise weapons. They raised sound. The builders gathered in the plaza. They brought drums carved from ceiba wood, flutes of bone, shells strung with beads. But they did not play them. They placed them on the ground. And then, they waited for the wind. When it came, soft at first, then rising, the instruments played themselves. A low hum, like the breath of the earth. A ripple through the city. A voice older than language. The soldiers reached the causeways. And stopped. They heard the song. Not a warning. An invitation. To remember. Some turned back. Others dropped their blades. A few walked forward and wept. Not because they were afraid, Because they understood. They had been taught to conquer. But here was something they could not hold. Presence. Unyielding. Undefended. Unbroken. The mask remained untouched. And the armies did not return. But La Venta understood. The world was changing. Not all would listen. Not all wanted to. The city gathered once more. They made a choice. Not to hide. To preserve. They buried the mask. Not deep. Just enough. They placed it beneath a circle of basalt, surrounded by maize and obsidian and feathers of sacred birds. Over it, they built nothing. No temple. No monument. Just sky. They left it open to the stars. And then they stepped back. And let the wind carry the silence forward. Years passed. Then generations. The jungle grew thicker. The canals dried. The fire dimmed. But the mask remained. And those who carried the breath of U-Kan-Lel moved outward. Not in exile. In resonance. They built new cities, some of stone, some of sound, some of shadow. And in each they left a shape. A spiral, a hand, a face that listened. And though the names changed, the rhythm endured. Because U-Kan-Lel had never been a man alone. He had been the mask we all carry, waiting to remember. Long after the fires of La Venta dimmed and the final stone of San Lorenzo was swallowed by vine and root, the world moved on. But not forward. It moved outward, like rings in water after a stone has sunk. The people who had once gathered in breath and silence scattered like pollen. Some carried seeds. Others carried songs. But all of them carried something they didn't have words for. Not tradition. Not religion. Memory without origin. They settled in valleys where clouds clung to mountaintops, on coasts where obsidian shards glinted beneath wet sand, and in forests so dense even the wind moved differently. Their new homes bore no resemblance to the ancient cities, yet their hands still shaped the same spiral. They built platforms not to replicate but to resonate. Shrines emerged with no idol, only a polished bowl that caught sunlight at dawn. Children learned to whisper their dreams into clay before it was fired. The past had not been buried. It had become breath. But over time, the silence of U-Kan-Lel's legacy was met by a world that no longer trusted silence. New powers rose across Mesoamerica. Cities with names etched in stone and blood. Tikal, Calakmul, Monte Alban, Teotihuacan. They measured time in centuries and conquest. Their gods had faces and histories and titles. Their kings walked on elevated roads and sat atop pyramids that pierced the clouds. Their priests painted the future in crimson lines. To them, the old ways were ghosts, unwritten, unnamed, unclaimed. But the influence of U-Kan-Lel had not vanished. It had dispersed, like dust in the air, too fine to grasp, too persistent to ignore. It hid in the architecture of dreams, in the spaces between rituals, in the unspoken rules that guided hands to lay stones just so. Every civilization that followed, no matter how loud, how structured, how adorned, owed something to the man who had once listened to the earth. But they didn't know his name, so they gave him others. In the highlands, he became the earth listener, an ancestor spirit who had no temple, only footprints carved in riverbeds. In the jungles, he was known as the Whispering Jaguar, a god who refused sacrifice and walked the world in mist. Among the desert people, he was remembered as the first echo, the one who taught stone how to speak before men learned to shout. He became the god of absence, the god of patterns, the god of things that endure because they do not insist. No image of him survived, only forms, a curve in a road, a doorway aligned to a solstice, a bowl placed where it would catch the first drop of rain. In time, even those who preserved the memory forgot its origin. They continued the motions, the rituals, the alignments, the songs, but the why was lost. All that remained was feeling. And then came the scribes. In the great cities that followed, writing emerged, not as reflection but as control. Names became boundaries. Kings recorded their victories in glyphs carved deep into stone. Priests wrote the names of gods in red ink, bound to symbols no one could misinterpret. Precision was law. Silence was suspect. But among the builders there were still whispers. Old ones. Stonecutters who aligned temples without consulting charts. Midwives who buried afterbirth in spirals around saber roots. Farmers who planted maize not by calendar, but by wind. And they remembered, not with words, with shape. When asked why they did what they did, they shrugged. It's always been this way. But it hadn't. It had begun with a man who listened more than he spoke. A man who left no law, only pattern. And so the gods of empire continued to grow. They had names and empires. They demanded sacrifice. They promised reward. They walked in poems and ruled in blood. But beneath them, beneath every city, every altar, every glyph was another rhythm. Unclaimed. Unending. Then came the collapse. The cities burned. The priests fell silent. The gods with names disappeared from the stones. And in the ash, something remained. Still breathing. Still listening. Still forming. A mask, unearthed from a hillside near the coast. Greenstone. Symmetrical. Breathless. The farmers who found it said nothing. They did not sell it. They placed it facing east. And walked away. Elsewhere, a ruined plaza was discovered by children chasing birds. In its center, a bowl basalt cracked, but intact. At noon, the light struck it with a precision the children didn't understand. But they returned every day to watch it happen again. And again. Until they began to sit in silence before it. As their grandparents watched from the shadows. No one told them to. They simply knew. And on the mountains above a forgotten lake, a wind tunnel carved in rock still sings when the breeze strikes it at just the right angle. Locals claim you can hear a voice. Not words. Presence. A rhythm. Some say it's a god. Others, a trick of air. But the elders? They smile. They remember. In a world built on conquest, monuments, and declarations, U-Kan-Lel had become the one thing that could not be erased. Form without name. Voice without sound. God without altar. He was not worshipped. He was repeated. Unconsciously. Constantly. Every time a builder adjusted a stone to match a shadow. Every time a mother aligned her sleeping child's head to the rising sun. Every time a dancer turned once left before spiraling right. He lived not in stories, but in gestures. And perhaps that is why his name was forgotten. Because the work he began was never meant to end. Because to name him would be to contain him. And U-Kan-Lel was not meant to be contained. He was the wind before it speaks. The silence before it answers. The God of all things unnamed, unshaped, and enduring. And though time would grind the stones of La Venta to dust, though San Lorenzo would be buried beneath centuries of root and earth, though empires would rise and fall, though gods would come and go, the spiral remained, drawn in sand, etched in bone, sung in breath, waiting not to be found, but to be remembered. It begins with a shovel, a single bite into the earth, wet, sticky, reluctant. A team of archaeologists stands beneath the relentless heat of the Gulf Coast, staring at an unassuming patch of ground just outside what the maps call La Venta Complex A. They have permits, instruments, theories. They've read every paper, memorized every glyph, debated the meaning of every calendar round and every head. They've come looking for clarity, for artifacts, for proof. What they find is a fragment, not large, not monumental, just a piece of greenstone, flat and curved, too smooth to be natural, too silent to be meaningless. They brush it gently, and there it is, a cheekbone, not carved with ego or extravagance, perfectly symmetrical, the fragment of a mask. They don't know it yet, but they have found the last breath of U-Kan-Lel. Not a tomb, a whisper. The dig accelerates. Week by week, more pieces emerge. Not just stone, but placement. Offerings layered in concentric circles, jade beads, obsidian blades, maize kernels turned to ash. Every object oriented toward a single empty space in the center, as though something once lay there and had simply dissolved. No bones, no glyphs, no name, just presence. And around that absence, silence. It unnerves them, because it cannot be explained. There is no record of this ritual, no codex to interpret, no matching pattern in Mayan, Zapotec, or Aztec archives. It doesn't fit. It doesn't speak in the language of empire. But it speaks. Slowly, the team begins to feel it. Not in the data, in the air, in the way the wind moves through the dig site, in how the birds perch in a circle around the trench, silent, in how the sound recorder placed near the greenstone fragment picks up a low-frequency hum no one can identify. They bring in specialists, linguists, engineers, historians. The hum persists, untranslatable. Then someone remembers a pattern. From San Lorenzo, plaza alignment. The greenstone piece, when placed along a matching axis, reflects sunlight only on 2 days a year, the solstices, and when it does, a shadow forms, a spiral, turning inward, exactly like the stele in the mountains above the vanished city once called Toulon, exactly like the shape drawn in maize fields by farmers who claim no heritage but speak in rhythms older than the wheel. The team begins to realize, this is not an isolated find. It is a breath in a sentence spoken across millennia. And suddenly, the story of U-Kan-Lel is not a myth. It's an echo. Across museums, they begin to look again. A small bowl with perfectly round walls, mislabeled as ritual vessel, is found to reflect sound in 3 distinct tones depending on the wind's direction. A child's toy from a coastal dig site, carved into a spiral, spins counterclockwise only when aligned to magnetic north. A broken statue from a marketplace once destroyed in conquest reveals, when reassembled, not a deity, but a human face with closed eyes and a single wordless glyph beneath it. Not one of these objects is labeled U-Kan-Lel, but they all carry him. The archaeologists don't call it that. They don't dare. Academia prefers certainty. But the assistants, the field hands, the locals who return to the site after hours, barefoot and curious, they begin to say his name again, quietly, like a memory surfacing from deep water. Not because they believe, because they feel. And so, the story of U-Kan-Lel rises again, not in textbooks, but in gestures. In how a museum curator realigns an exhibit slightly so that light falls on a mask's cheek. In how a child in Veracruz draws spirals in the sand after visiting a ruined mound. In how a filmmaker, researching ancient architecture, notices that every city begins with breath. Plazas built to catch wind, temples that echo footsteps in sets of 3, roads that always turn east before they turn north. He makes a documentary. He doesn't mention U-Kan-Lel, but he ends with a question. What if the first civilization didn't teach us how to rule? What if it taught us how to remember? And millions watch, not because they are told to, because something stirs. In the silence, in the stone, in the spiral they have drawn since childhood. Without knowing why, U-Kan-Lel does not return. He does not appear in vision, nor in prophecy, nor in the ink of a newly found codex. He never does, because he never left. He is the voice from the stone, not carved, not spoken, felt, and in that feeling we are returned not to the past, but to the possibility, that long before we conquered the world, we learned to listen to it, to shape it gently, to build not for glory, but for rhythm, to lead not with the sword, but with the placement of a single stone in the right place at the right time. A stone that still breathes, still watches, still waits. We do not need to believe in U-Kan-Lel to carry him. We already do. In every pattern we obey without knowing why. In every silence we honor when the answers fall away. In every breath we take before we speak. The voice from the stone is not ancient. It is now. It is us.